Nine Soul's most tragic character offers a startlingly precise dramatization of Buddhist theories about perception, suffering, and liberation. And the video game medium forces us as players to experientially engage with these concepts rather than merely understand them intellectually. Lady Ethereal, a scientist whose consciousness has been forcibly preserved as only a brain for 500 years, embodies the Buddhist analysis of how suffering arises from the interaction between consciousness, perception, and the content of mind. Her narrative arc, from benevolent inventor to nightmare-trapped ghost, maps directly onto Buddhist philosophy in ways that only an interactive medium can achieve. Lady Ethereal created the Soulscape system, a virtual reality designed to maintain brain activity during hibernation. The purpose of this Soulscape was to save the Solarian species, these cat-like creatures that are our primary characters in the game. Now, 8 of her colleagues, including what is presumed to be her romantic partner Xiao He, volunteered for a 30-day trial of the Soulscape. Unfortunately, this technology worked too perfectly. When subjects awakened, they couldn't distinguish dreams from reality, and even those that could wish to go back to that dream-like state. 4 of them committed suicide by hanging themselves, 1 tore out his eye, and Xiao He tried to strangle Lady Ethereal while crying and laughing uncontrollably before dying. These dreams were so blissful that waking reality became an unbearable hell. Buddhist philosophy categorizes perception into 18 dhatus. 6 sense organs, or the eyes, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. 6 sense objects, visible forms, sound, smell, tastes, tangible or touch, and mental objects, and 6 corresponding consciousnesses. Now the final grouping there, that 6th level, the mind level and mental consciousness, that is what Lady Ethereal's technology corrupted. Her Soulscape isolated that 6th channel of perception, flooding it with perfect mental objects while severing the connection to the 5 sense channels. This result was catastrophic because Buddhist psychology teaches us that healthy perception requires the interaction of all 18 dhatus, not just the 3 mental ones. Lady Ethereal's test subjects lost this distinction. They couldn't tell whether their experience arose from their physical senses or solely from their mind. In Buddhist terms, they suffered a complete dhatu confusion, unable to locate themselves within the structure of perception and reality itself. The Mahayana Abhidharma's Yogacara school deepens this analysis with their theory of 8 consciousnesses. Beyond the 6 that we mentioned before, they identify the Klishthamanas, or the afflicted mind. The consciousness that creates duality, the sense that I am separate from you, that the observer is separate from what's observed. This is the consciousness that creates our fundamental ignorance. Beneath even this lies the alavijnana, or the storehouse consciousness, the repository of all of our past experiences, the karmic seeds that shape how we perceive everything. Lady Ethereal's Soulscape was meant to provide pleasant experiences during hibernation, but what it actually did was flood the alavijnana with perfect, idealized mental objects while isolating the subjects from their physical reality. When her companions woke up, their storehouse consciousness had been fundamentally rewritten. The real world couldn't compete with this perfection that they had experienced, and their Klishthamanas, or the sense of duality between dream and reality, had completely broken down. They couldn't maintain the distinction between one being a dream and one being real because the Soulscape had made that boundary disappear. Now, unable to bear her guilt, Lady Ethereal eventually tried to end her own life support, but she was completely denied death. Someone had forcefully preserved her brain in a vital sanctum, trapping her consciousness in her own soulscape for 500 years. When we finally reach her domain, we discover the brain room. Lady Ethereal exists as a preserved brain and spine housed in a machine, surrounded by hundreds of harvested human brains arranged in this twisted produce garden hell. Lady Ethereal has been reduced to consciousness without form. It's the Yogacara school taken to its nightmarish extreme. Her entire world is cognition only, but not as liberation. It's a prison. Her storehouse consciousness has become this repository of trauma, endlessly replaying again and again. Her Klishtamana creating this duality where there should be none, asking, is she a scientist or this monster? Is this reality or a nightmare? She represents an I must scream existence, fully conscious but unable to achieve either death or awakening, trapped in the very technology she created, living hell day after day. Lady Ethereal's name in the original Chinese version of the game is Fu Die, which references Zhuangzi's butterfly dream. This is a Taoist parable where this philosopher dreams of being a butterfly, and when waking up asks, am I a person who dreamed of being a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming of being a person? Lady Ethereal's character design incorporates this butterfly and moth motif. She has wing-like formal wear, wing markings on her forehead, and the climactic emergence of butterfly or moth wings covered in eyes protruding from a surgical incision in the back of her skull during the third phase of her boss fight. Now, Buddhist philosophy takes a very nuanced position on dreams, and Lady Ethereal very clearly illuminates that. Dreams are real experiences in the moment that they occur. The experience itself is actual and true. But dreams are also illusory in that they lack any sort of inherent independent existence. Importantly, though, Lady Ethereal can't distinguish between what is a dream and what is reality. So when the player's character Yi enters her soulscape, she tells him, this here is reality. The reality that you speak of, that's just a dream. Her madness isn't delusion in an ordinary sense. She has achieved through trauma the Buddhist insight that dream and the waking reality share the same sort of status as lacking substantial nature, but this was achieved without a sense of liberation. Her reality, as through her soulscape's dream, is fully built on her storehouse consciousness. She's infinitely attached to her guilt, to her dead companions, and to her identity as a monster. Now, the developers of Nine Souls, Red Candle Games, they came into it with a mastery of psychological horror. Previous titles, Detention and Devotion, pioneered some of these horror elements that you'll see in Nine Souls, and particularly through Lady Ethereal's soulscape. Her soulscape reveals that the studio never truly left their horror roots behind. They've just developed new horror techniques that work very well in service of exploring Buddhist philosophy through the game. Red Candle understands that true horror comes from watching what seems so safe and welcoming deteriorate. When we enter Lady Ethereal's soulscape, it seems beautiful, it's dreamlike, it's heaven-like. But the corruption of the space becomes infinitely more disturbing because of this. We get these soft colors, gentle music, peaceful companions lounging at a hot spring. Everything seems like bliss. But we learn that this isn't the true reality of Lady Ethereal's soulscape. The more we explore, the more this dream collapses into a vicious nightmare. What's funny is her companions in the soulscape are themselves not real, nor is their happiness. These are her dead companions appearing happy and in the way that Lady Ethereal wanted them to be when developing the soulscape system. But as we loop through this area again and again, we see them start to go insane. They get deranged expressions. They cry, "This is your fault." The lakes turn to blood. We get this dark world with human brains, thorny wreaths, and floating heads resembling Lady Ethereal that shriek when they're killed. We see the original tragedy of this entire existence, that Lady Ethereal has been forced to live for 500 years. The brilliance of this approach from Red Candle is that it makes us complicit in Lady Ethereal's suffering. We're not watching her deteriorate from a safe distance. We are literally inside her mind, experiencing her nightmare and triggering her traumatic memories through our exploration. Buddhist philosophy teaches us that ignorance is the root of suffering, but Red Candle inverts this. The forced knowledge that we get from this exploration becomes suffering. We can't unsee what we learn about Lady Ethereal's guilt. We become trapped in her trauma alongside her. Her boss fight escalates this horror in 3 distinct phases. In the first phase, she appears mostly humanoid, with pink fur, her butterfly wing dress, seemingly elegant yet sorrowful. But she begs Yi to hurt her, to punish her for her sins, and when we comply, she transforms. Phase 2 begins to really reveal this nightmare form. Sharp claws for hands, glowing red eyes, her head peeling open, seeing this brain coming out of her skull. She gets a bright red grin, and everything becomes darker and darker. We see her companions on her hands in the background, hung as they were when they committed suicide. It's guilt made manifest, trauma crystallized through this environment. When we get to phase 3, we see this incision tear fully open and butterfly wings sprout out, covered in eyes, her guilt being personified as this parasitic creature that's eating her from the inside out. The mechanic of her boss fight is her creating clones of herself. As you can see through my own run-throughs of this boss fight, you're constantly hitting these shadow clones. You're asking yourself, what is real? What is not? The answer is the one whose mask breaks, whose face unmasks to reveal the nightmare underneath. Through all these 3 phases, we see this visual representation of her actively decaying mind, her shaking her head, screaming in constant agony from everything she's experienced. Nine Souls achieves something that passive media cannot. It makes us practice Buddhist philosophy rather than merely understanding it conceptually. Nine Souls' combat system was explicitly designed around the Taoist concept of wu wei, or effortless action. The game's parry and deflect system forces us to stop attacking recklessly and instead respond to the flow of combat. We use the opponent's energy against them rather than generating the force ourselves. You can't succeed in combat through relentless button mashing. You have to observe, wait, and respond to the attacks that opponents throw at you. Over dozens of deaths against fighting Lady Ethereal, you start to internalize this rhythm of her fight, the wu wei that the game designers explicitly intended. Lady Ethereal's shadow clones are the perfect embodiment of trying to understand this. They all have their own attack patterns as we try to distinguish what is the real Lady Ethereal. Once you find the quote-unquote real Lady Ethereal, that's the one who is unmasked and who we are able to inflict the damage on. Further, this death and rebirth cycle is something that becomes very philosophical. Funnily enough, I talked about this in both my videos on Celeste and Nier Automata, but every failure against Lady Ethereal is information. Every retry is a practice towards mastery. I found myself doing better and better and pushing farther and farther every time I did this boss fight, taking less hits, learning those patterns more, and being able to react better to what she brings to the table. After spending a significant period of time learning her patterns and finally defeating her in this boss fight, we lived her trauma long enough that her liberation is something that feels earned not just for her, but for us as well. Yi's only presented with two options: kill her or become trapped in her soulscape to atone together. This demand maps onto a central Buddhist paradox. If there is no self, who suffers? Who is punished? Who is liberated? When Yi chooses to listen to Lady Ethereal's pain confessions rather than simply fighting, something shifts. After her defeat, the game presents genuine release. She's freed from 500 years of emotional agony. Her rested soul heads to the afterlife with her companions. Her final words, "I have faced my sins. Now it's your turn," pass the burden of confrontation to Yi, which ultimately leads to the second half of the game. Is liberation salvific? Lady Ethereal's black and white self-condemnation dissolves, her identity as a monster is released, and she stops grasping at punishment for meaning. The fact that she's able to die peacefully, reuniting with her companions, suggests a genuine liberation rather than annihilation. But the fact of the matter is, this mechanism is horribly tragic. This liberation came only through 500 years of forced suffering, through violent confrontation, and through the destruction of her preserved consciousness. In a way, you could almost describe this as liberation through exhaustion. She suffered so completely that she finally realized there's no point in grasping at this past experience anymore. It's a compassionate tragedy rather than triumphant awakenings. Lady Ethereal's narrative arc provides a Buddhist case study in consciousness, suffering, and the possibility of release. Her character demonstrates that consciousness without embodied form becomes a prison. The 5 physical sense channels matter because they ground us in interdependent reality rather than isolated mental construction. Her soulscape tragedy illustrates the dangers of Dhatu confusion. When mind consciousness loses connection to the other elements of perception, we get madness. Her 500 years of guilt dramatize how attachment to self-narrative perpetuates suffering. She constructed an identity as a monster and tortured herself in an endless cycle in a reality of her own mind. But her ending offers genuine hope. Liberation came not through punishment, but through being heard. Yi's willingness to listen rather than simply attack created space for Lady Ethereal to release her grasping. Her peaceful death alongside her companions suggests that Buddhist liberation remains possible even after extreme suffering, that the storehouse consciousness can eventually empty its traumatic seeds. Lady Ethereal provides specific, visual, emotionally resonant examples of abstract Buddhist concepts. The 18 Dhatus become comprehensible through her soulscape's corruption of the 6th channel, the mental channel. The concept of no self manifests in her deteriorating dream companions. The paradox of liberation without a self to liberate plays out in her death that is finally rest. And the video game medium transforms these concepts from philosophy into experience. We practice non-reactive awareness through combat, feel disorientation through the unmappable reality that is her soulscape, and confront impermanence through the permanent loss of her domain. Nine Souls suggests that the path to liberation runs through confrontation rather than avoidance, through acceptance of natural cycles rather than technological transcendence, through releasing the self-narrative of guilt rather than clinging to it as an identity. Lady Ethereal's arc is both tragic and salvific. Tragic because 500 years of suffering preceded the release, salvific because release genuinely came. The butterfly finally emerged from the nightmare, though the dreamer had to dissolve for it to fly free.